Rose Valley, a small town, is home to the Maple Grove Mills, a specialty supplier of natural, organic, and heirloom grain-based products. Founded in the early 1900s, the mills were handed down through 3 generations of the Maple Grove family before becoming an employee-owned company in 1996. At the beginning of the 21st century, the Maple Grove Mills employed 5,000 people, providing a majority of Rose Valley's jobs, with the rest of the town's economy mostly supported by the income from those jobs. My name is Roger Richardson, and Rose Valley is where I was born and raised. You may have noticed that I didn't say it's my home, or my hometown, or any of the other things people say when they talk about places they live, or used to live, and have warm feelings of love or nostalgia for, and therein lies my story. My older brother Jeff and I weren't officially considered mill kids because our parents weren't employees of the Maple Grove Mills. Mom and Dad owned and operated, and Mom still owns and operates, Richardson's Garden, the town's only Chinese restaurant, across the street and a block south from City Hall. Richardson's Garden was opened in 1947 by our grandparents. Grandpa was the scion of a successful Portland restaurant family, and after he returned from service in World War II, he and my grandmother were ready to open their own place. Rather than start yet another restaurant in Portland's Chinatown, they chose Rose Valley. Why here? Because the town didn't have a Chinese restaurant, and with his fellow servicemen coming home from the Pacific Theater after being exposed to the cuisines of places like Japan, China, the Philippines, etc., Grandpa saw an opportunity outside the big city. At first, the restaurant was called Richardson's Chinese and American. Grandma and Grandpa bought a downtown coffee shop from Fred and Mary Peterson, an elderly couple ready to retire, and added a selection of Cantonese dishes to the Petersons' existing menu. They held on to longtime customers by keeping everyone's favorite items, especially Mary Peterson's fried chicken, which Mary herself used to come in every Friday to make until Grandma had the recipe down. Mary's chicken is still on the dinner menu every Friday night, by the way. At first, Grandma and Grandpa lived in one of the apartments upstairs from the restaurant, but when my dad was born, the family built a tea garden and house behind the restaurant. When Grandpa passed away and Grandma retired, Mom and Dad took over running the restaurant, while Jeff and I spent most of our after-school time in the house under Grandma's watchful eye. Grandma passed away when I was a senior in high school, and Jeff was in his 3rd year at Portland State University. My girl next door was Kathy Henderson. Her father, Pete, was a deputy with the county sheriff, and her mother, Nancy, supplemented Pete's salary by working a few hours a day at Richardson's Garden. The Hendersons actually lived next door to our grandparents' house, not the restaurant, but since Jeff and I were at the house most afternoons after school and all day on weekends, close enough. When I was 8 and Kathy was starting the 1st grade, our parents assigned Jeff and me to walk her to and from school. One day when she got home, she told her mother, "I'm going to marry Roger when I grow up." And from that day on, nothing ever happened to convince our parents that anything different was going to happen. Kathy and I were best friends in grammar school, went steady in high school, and during my first 2 years away from home at PSU, spent as many weekends and holidays as we could together. It was during one of my visits home, for Kathy's senior prom, that we gave each other our virginities. As soon as Kathy graduated high school, she showed up in Portland as a PSU freshman. In June of 2001, Jeff passed the Oregon bar. Kathy received her bachelor's in accounting. I added an MBA to the bachelor's in mechanical engineering I had received 2 years earlier, and we all came home to Rose Valley to begin our new jobs. Jeff became an associate to a local general practice attorney. Kathy signed on as a junior accountant in the Maple Grove Finance Department, and I went to work as an engineer in the Maple Grove Operations Department, which managed the company's production, quality control, packaging, and distribution. Kathy and I had been unofficially engaged ever since that day. She had first declared her intention to marry me when we grew up. When we returned home, we made our engagement official, ring and all, and we tied the knot that September. In January of 2002, Pete Henderson was struck and killed by a car while assisting a stranded motorist. Soon after that, our dad was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and even though it was caught early, it didn't seem to respond to treatment. We lost him just after Christmas. Faced with the prospect of living alone in their houses next door to one another, our moms decided to become roommates. Mom moved in with Kathy's mom, Kathy, and I moved down from our apartment over the restaurant. Jeff was living in the other one, to the house, and my cousin John from Portland moved into the apartment and became the restaurant's new chef. Our mothers insisted that Kathy and I shouldn't put off starting our family any further. I think planning for the birth of their new grandchild gave them something to keep their minds off our losses of the previous year. Our daughter, Lana, entered the world on October 24, 2003. She was perfect. Rose Valley had always seemed isolated from the ups and downs of the national economy. No matter what was going on in other economic sectors, people still needed what the Maple Grove mills produced. The first downer of the 21st century was no exception to this, but soon after, another economic monster came upon the scene: unregulated mortgages. Our town wasn't a fertile field for the McMansions that grew like a fungus across much of the country. The mill's employee management board kept a tight rein on the company's growth to avoid the kind of boom-and-bust hiring and layoff cycles that seemed to characterize employment in the modern world, and we were too far from the nearest center of growth to be a commuter bedroom community. But mortgage refinancing was another matter. Homeowners were bombarded with offers to refinance homes at amazingly low interest rates, and those who responded found their homes appraised at higher values than they had ever thought possible. Americans became enamored with the miraculous concept of using their homes as ATMs, and the citizens of Rose Valley were as susceptible to the epidemic as everyone else. In 2008, the bubble burst. America discovered that predatory lenders had targeted borrowers who could never make their payments when low rates didn't stay low, that corrupt appraisers had deliberately overvalued homes, and that banks were hiding bad loans by bundling them with good ones into securities that were knowingly being overrated. Borrowers in Rose Valley, as in the rest of America, found themselves buried in debt and their homes sinking deeper and deeper underwater. And that was when the worst predator of all made his appearance. His name was Daniel Moore, multimillionaire president of Moore Equity Partners, a private equity firm that acquired small companies and regrew them, and he seemed to appear as if by magic during the worst of the mortgage crash. To Rose Valley homeowners being hounded by lenders threatening foreclosure on their underwater mortgages, Moore Equity's offer to buy the Maple Grove mills was like throwing life preservers to the passengers of the Titanic. The company quickly divided into two camps, for and against accepting the buyout offer. I was among those who argued against. Congress and both candidates in the presidential election were already starting to talk about passing some sort of debt relief, and it seemed premature to be jumping from using homes as ATMs into doing the same with the town's primary source of jobs. And the amount offered was lower than most business analysts thought the company should be worth. But most of all, to be blunt, Moore was a swaggering, arrogant person, and there was something about him and his people that simultaneously made me uneasy and angry. But the money being offered, divided amongst the employee owners, would be enough for people to get out from under. Most of the proceeds people received would go to the lenders, but their loans would be paid off. And Moore and his partners offered all sorts of optimistic projections about how much they could grow the company and bring real growth to Rose Valley's stagnant local economy. Those of us who opposed the sale were outvoted, and at the end of October 2008, the 102-year history of the Maple Grove Mills as a locally owned and operated Rose Valley company came to an end, and the company became Maple Grove, Incorporated. Problems began almost as soon as the new management was in place. Local family farmers who had sold to Maple Grove for generations found themselves forced to lower their prices or lose sales to out-of-state suppliers, and even if they agreed, payments took longer and longer. Production was ordered to increase speed, and quality inspectors were overruled when they wanted to halt the lines to fix problems. Even the packaging started coming from unfamiliar sources and was of cheaper quality. Distributors and retail outlets started complaining about product quality. But month after month, finance kept reporting a healthy increase in sales and profits, so nothing was ever done. The new management said it was just a reflection of the degree to which the old Maple Grove had gold-plated its products to the point where they weren't bringing in an optimal return on investment. It just didn't make sense to me. How could management that was just so obviously stupid be running the company profitably? Maybe it was because I had grown up watching Robert Maple Grove and my father throwing back shots of single malt and rice beiju every Friday night as a kid. Or the sage advice both men had given Jeff and me during our teen years about never giving anything less than our best efforts. Or maybe it was the little voice in my head that kept telling me that what we were being told just didn't make any sense, but keeping my mouth shut and my head down while the more management turned what used to be a high-quality line of products into utter junk just didn't sit well with me. I persisted in raising issues, and as time passed, the idea of walking away from a job I found myself less and less able to take pride in. And joining Mom in running Richardson's garden was starting to sound better and better to me. The worst thing about what was happening at Maple Grove was that Kathy didn't seem to think there was anything wrong. Okay, so the quality of our product wasn't what it used to be. Maybe consumers really didn't care if their flours and meals were made from lower quality ingredients, weren't as consistently milled as they used to be, and weren't as well packaged as they used to be. After all, sales hadn't suffered, and revenues were actually up, weren't they? "We're not owners anymore, Roger," Kathy would say. "We just put in a day's work and collect our checks now, unless you keep stirring things up the way you are." The less said about Kathy's reaction to my thoughts about quitting Maple Grove in favor of the restaurant, the better. They weren't pretty. As time passed, there was less and less shop talk between us. But Lana was a good listener, even if her solution to all of Daddy's sad moments was a tea party with dolls. January of 2009 saw the inauguration of a new president. A month later, federal programs were passed to modify and refinance troubled home mortgages to reduce payments and foreclosures. Economists and politicians still argue about whether these programs were successful, so I won't say that Rose Valley's mortgage foreclosure crisis could have been resolved without the employees of Maple Grove Mills cashing out their ownership of the company. But to this day, the fact that we couldn't persuade them to try still sticks in my craw. By the summer of 2009, it had become obvious that the economy wasn't in just another recession. The domestic uncertainty of the war on terror, 2 foreign wars, the near crash of the stock market, the bursting of the housing bubble, and the epidemic of mortgages gone bad had been labeled the Great Recession, and America was hemorrhaging jobs. So it didn't come as a surprise to anyone that despite continuing to report record sales and profits, layoffs came to Maple Grove for the first time since the Great Depression of the 1930s. There was a lot of big talk from management about how the reductions would, hopefully, not be long-term and about severance benefits, but it did not go unnoticed that the 30% or so of Maple Grove's employees who lost their jobs consisted almost exclusively of those who had voted against the sell-off to more equity partners the year before and shown reluctance to go along to get along with the new management. "So you'll get your wish about becoming kitchen help after all," Kathy sneered as we waited for my turn at the guillotine. Her tone was anything but sympathetic. If anything, it was mocking. I let it pass. There was just no point in another of those exchanges. My time was better spent with Lana and her dolls. By the time my call from HR came, I was ready to leave. "Never mind the separation benefits speech, Sharon," I told the HR manager as I walked into her office. "I'm not going to sign the non-disclosure agreement or the release of claims waiver. Just hand me the state-mandated checks for my last week and my unused vacation, and get my COBRA forms into the mail. And I'll be on my way." "I'm sorry, Roger," Sharon said sadly. Sharon Metcalf had been Maple Grove's HR manager since before I had joined the company. a usually smiling woman about my mom's age. She was the company's unofficial den mother, and like me, had voted against the Moore buyout. I had no doubt that she felt just as bad about what was happening to the company as I did. But there's a lot I'm supposed to go over with you. Well, what are they going to do to me if I refuse to sit through it? I asked with a shrug. Fire me. Save a place for me on the unemployment line. Sharon sighed as she handed me my severance packet. She obviously expected that once she had delivered everyone else's, there'd be one for her as well. Come by the restaurant when you don't have to worry about being accused of fraternizing with the enemy anymore, I told her. Dinner and an umbrella drink on me. Deal. We shook on it, and she even kissed me on the cheek before I left. I had removed all the personal property I wanted to keep from the office weeks ago, so I just said, "Let's go," to the security guard whose task it was to escort me from the building, got into my car, and headed for Lana's school. A tea party with dolls sounded like just what I needed right about now. I got to the school as classes were breaking for lunch, and after stopping in at the office to arrange a family emergency release for the rest of the school day, buckled Lana into her car seat and headed for home. Kathy didn't answer her phone when I called, so I had no idea if she knew I'd been walked out the door. I made a quick call to let the grandmas know that they wouldn't need to pick Lana up after school as they usually did, headed for home, and figured we'd all have a family meeting about it when Kathy got home. Something didn't feel right when we got home. Maybe I just wasn't used to seeing the house empty, especially at midday. Or maybe that day, everything in the world just felt not right. It wasn't as if the house had been stripped, or there were drawers or closet doors left open. I'll probably never know why it felt the way it did. But the note on the kitchen table left no doubt about what wasn't right. You had to do it. You just couldn't let it go, and now you're fired. I'm not going to end up supporting your dream of being kitchen help. I'm leaving you for someone who can do better for me and Lana. You can keep everything. I don't want any of it. Don't bother to look for us. We're gone, and you'll never find us. Sign the papers when you're served and don't make problems, or you'll never see your daughter again. Crap, I muttered to myself and hit Jeff's speed dial. Jeff, I got fired today, and Kathy's gone. She left a note that says she's taken Lana, and if I don't sign divorce papers, I'll never see her again. But I picked Lana up before I came home, and she's with me. Get out of there right now, Roger, Jeff said. Don't wait for the papers. You and Lana come to the office, and make sure you bring that note with you. 20 minutes later, I was sitting at a conference table with Jeff and his boss, Alex Benson, while Alex's PA was keeping Lana entertained. You've thrown a monkey wrench into your wife's plan, Alex told me. You were supposed to be sitting in an exit interview while she took Lana and left, probably for somewhere out of state. Any idea who this someone who can do better is? Jeff asked. Not a clue, I said. My guess is that it's one of those out-of-town managers that Moore brought in to run the mills, but she's never mentioned any of them by name. What about her threat? Jeff asked. Can she do that? Keep Roger from seeing Lana. If she'd managed to get her out of state, maybe. Alex said, Kathy's note in his hand. But she shot herself in the foot with this. The state of Oregon, like most other states, makes custody decisions based on which parent represents the best interests of the child. Unlike some other states, however, Oregon law specifically bars basing that decision on whether the parent is the mother or the father. Is one of you the primary caregiver? We've both always worked, I replied. I drop Lana off at school every morning. One of our mothers picks her up after school, and they both look after her until we get home from work. Either of you ever abused the other, verbally or physically, or abused Lana? No, and we practically live with our family, so there's no way anything like that could happen without them knowing. Now that you've lost your job, will you have financial issues supporting a child? I've always had a fallback in the family business, and if Lana is living here, she's got 2 grandmothers for a support system. And an uncle, Jeff added. Then the biggest factors the court will consider will be the attitude of parents toward the child, and the willingness and ability of each parent to facilitate and encourage a close and continuing relationship between the other parent and the child. And this, Alex said, waving Kathy's note, is going to be Kathy's kryptonite. Threatening to withhold access to a child to force your spouse to sign divorce papers will be the opposite of encouraging a close and continuing relationship in the eyes of the court. And so we filed a counterclaim, arguing that Kathy's plan to abscond with our daughter and use threats to withhold visitation to extort my signature on the divorce papers, a plan that was only thwarted by my unexpected early departure from being terminated from my job, was evidence that granting her any form of custody was not in the best interests of the child. The court granted me temporary custody pending a final decision, and we prepared to do legal battle. The high-priced legal team that appeared in court to argue against us quickly revealed who Kathy's someone who can do better was. Daniel Moore. But you saw that coming, didn't you? I've already told you my opinion of Daniel Moore. He thought he was smarter, richer, and more powerful than you. So you should just lay down and let him walk all over you. Or rather, let those he hired to walk all over you do their jobs, because walking all over you himself was beneath him. But where our divorce was concerned, Moore's wealth, his power, and most importantly, his attitude all ended up working against him. Alex decided that Jeff should take the lead and be my attorney of record, while he served as advisor and took care of the rest of his and Jeff's clients. We'd be two brothers standing together against Moore's school of legal sharks, a pair of Davids against an army of Goliaths. The sight of a half-dozen lawyers in $5,000 suits showing up to try to steamroll over a small-town lawyer representing a newly unemployed husband and father, fighting for the daughter who was all he had left that could be taken from him, rubbed the county judge in the family court the wrong way from day one. The fact that the newly unemployed husband and father was being divorced and sued for custody by a wife who had left him for the wealthy man who had so recently made the husband and father unemployed and was paying for the half-dozen lawyers in $5,000 suits did nothing to relieve that first impression. When the mother of the wife who had left the newly unemployed husband and father angrily declared to the court that she would be happy to help her son-in-law care for her granddaughter, but wanted nothing to do with her own daughter, some of those lawyers in $5,000 suits started to look nervous. And when copies of the wife's "Screw You, Loser Kitchen Help farewell note threatening to keep the husband and father her lover had made newly unemployed from ever seeing his daughter again, were distributed in court, the half-dozen lawyers in $5,000 suits looked as if they'd rather be anywhere else but in that county judge's family court. Ultimately, the judge took Kathy's note at face value. She ruled that Kathy had relinquished all claim to our marital assets, not that there were all that many marital assets to claim. Our house was in my mother's name, as was the family business, so the assets consisted of our cars, IRAs, and the contents of our savings and checking accounts. But most importantly, the judge agreed with Jeff's argument that Kathy's threat was evidence of a negative attitude toward her own child and a clear unwillingness to facilitate and encourage a close and continuing relationship between the other parent and the child. She granted full custody of our daughter to me, allowing Kathy unlimited visitation, but only with court-approved supervision. Kathy stared daggers at me as she left the courtroom, and Moore, who had shown up only on the last day of proceedings, probably expecting to bask in the triumph of my defeat and humiliation, had the shocked look of a hulking bully who had just been beaten by a 98-pound weakling. We closed the restaurant that evening for a private celebration, though I seemed to spend most of the evening hugging a crying Nancy Henderson, thanking her for her support in court and assuring her that I didn't feel that what Kathy had done was in any way her fault. A couple of weeks after our divorce was final, Kathy became the fourth Mrs. Daniel Moore, and the happy couple made their home in Los Angeles. Kathy actually sent her mother a wedding invitation. Nancy's reaction was colorful and became characteristic of their relationship from that point on. Kathy flew back to Oregon in Moore's private jet every week, but her visits with Lana became problematic. The court readily accepted Lana's grandmothers as court-approved supervision, but their home, The house Kathy's parents had raised her in proved to be unworkable as a visitation location. Kathy and her mother kept getting into screaming arguments every time Kathy visited, the last of which ended with Nancy calling her daughter an evil 304 she was ashamed had ever come from her womb, and declaring that Kathy should never again dishonor her sainted father's memory by setting foot in his house. We moved visitations to the restaurant, where we rearranged one of our 2 private dining rooms into a play space. Nancy was more restrained in the presence of the staff and customers, but every time Kathy came, she took up a position at a table just outside the door, just in case she tries to do something she shouldn't. My idea about going back to the restaurant turned out to be premature. The reality was that having grown up in the business, there wasn't all that much left for me to learn about running it. And until my mother was ready to retire, I wasn't needed there full-time. And since Mom's opinion of retirement was that it was waiting to die, retirement wasn't going to happen anytime soon. So when Marty Ball, my former boss from Maple Grove operations who had been fired at the same time as me, stopped in one day to tell me that he and some of the other fired Maple Grove managers were getting together to talk about starting their own business, and asked if I would be interested in joining them, my answer was an immediate hell yeah. The idea behind the new business, which we named Falcon after the famous bird of prey, was to bring the suppliers who had been lowballed or dropped as vendors by the new Maple Grove together to form a cooperative. We'd produce a high-quality product and market it to boutique natural food retailers who were increasingly refusing to carry the lower-quality new Maple Grove products. Our foot in the door was that we were the management group from the old Maple Grove they used to have a good business relationship with. Since we didn't have any operations to manage yet, and if we ever did, Marty would manage them, I was tasked to apply my previously untapped MBA to devise a business plan we could present to banks to secure funding and a marketing plan to convince the people we wanted to bring together that we could actually sell what we proposed to produce. That was what I was working on the day the call came. "Roger," Jeff's shouting voice came from my phone when I picked up. "Where are you?" "Meeting in Pendleton," I replied, concerned at his tone. "What's up?" "Kathy tried to take Lana. Nancy tried to stop her, and Nancy and Lana are both in the hospital. It's bad, Roger. You have to get back here." On my way, I shouted and quickly broke up my meeting and ran for my car. I was about 70 miles from home and probably broke every speed limit there was along the quickest route back. As I drove, Jeff brought me up to speed. Kathy had arrived for her visitation as usual, in a big fancy car with a driver, who always waited in the lounge while Kathy was with Lana. But at the end of the visit, Kathy grabbed Lana's arm and started dragging her out the front door. Nancy tried to stop them, but Kathy's driver stepped up and blasted Nancy in the face with pepper spray, and as Nancy started screaming, the 2 of them exited with Lana in tow. Somehow, despite the searing pain and being nearly blinded by the chemicals in her eyes, Nancy ran after them. When Lana saw her grandma stumble and collapse in the street, she broke free from Kathy's grasp and ran back toward Nancy. The driver of the truck wasn't speeding, talking on his phone, texting, or doing anything else he shouldn't have been doing. But the realities of human reaction time and braking distance meant there was never any chance of swerving or stopping his huge, heavily loaded truck in time. Much later, I would learn that the truck's trailer was boldly emblazoned with the logo of the new Maple Grove Mills. My mother-in-law, Nancy Bridget Henderson, died in the emergency room shortly after I arrived at the hospital. She was 58 years old. My daughter, Lana Richardson, lingered in a coma for 8 days before her tiny body gave up fighting for life. She would have been 7 in another month. I checked out after that. I remember the doctor telling us Lana was gone. The next thing I knew, it was 2 days later, and I was in the restaurant kitchen cutting up a chicken. It should have been disquieting to suddenly find myself with a razor-sharp cleaver in my hand and no memory of how it got there or how I got where I was. But at the time, it just didn't seem to register. Apparently, Mom and Jeff had sort of hovered over me, and made sure I didn't do anything to harm myself with sharp things as they waited for me to get hold of myself. I guess I did, but at the cost of not being able to feel much of anything for a very long while. Arrangements were made for 2 more family funerals. I was surprised when I was informed that there were papers recently signed by Nancy naming me as her next of kin for all legal matters, and a will leaving everything to Lena and Slash or me. But it was something Chinese that Nancy had picked up from spending so much time working and living with my mom. I had married the daughter of a family with no sons, and Nancy had disowned her daughter for leaving me. So the duty of making Nancy's final arrangements and disposing of her estate fell to me as Nancy's son. I couldn't live in the house anymore. There were just too many memories, and they were all just too raw. I took Jeff's apartment, and he and cousin Jin argued over who should take the house. Jin prevailed by insisting that he had to be close to his kitchen. So Jeff ended up being the one living alone in a 3-bedroom house. Mom was technically living alone in Nancy's house, which was now legally mine. But she was spending most of her time in the restaurant, or with me in my apartment, and only going back to the house to sleep. Kathy and her driver had been arrested at the scene the day of the accident when the restaurant staff and witnesses on the street told police what they had seen. The DA charged Kathy with custodial interference in the 1st degree and her driver with kidnapping in the 2nd degree for their attempted abduction of Lana. The driver was also charged with assault in the 3rd degree for macing Nancy, all felonies, which enabled the DA to charge them both with 2 counts of felony murder for the deaths of Nancy and Lana. They were both facing mandatory prison sentences as high as 25 years. When the DA had Jeff and Alex appear at their arraignments to provide the judge with information about Kathy's previous threat to take Lana, the fact that Kathy had left me for a multimillionaire from out of state, and that her driver was employed by that same person, both were deemed flight risks and denied bail pending trial. I need to tell you that they probably won't be convicted on these charges, the DA told us, though I certainly think they're guilty of them. The vast majority of cases like this end in plea bargains. I don't suppose there's any chance of tying more to this, Jeff asked. It had to be his money behind it. I doubt it, the DA replied, but we could take a shot at offering them more generous plea bargains if they'll implicate him. If you think you can get them to do that, try, I said, still devoid of emotion. Otherwise, nothing you do can bring Nancy or Lana back, and I don't care. The DA proved to be correct. Neither Kathy nor the driver could implicate more, and they eventually entered guilty pleas to 2 counts of 2nd-degree manslaughter. With concurrent sentencing, they'd be eligible for parole after serving the state-mandated minimum sentence of 6 years and 3 months. I chose not to speak or submit a victim statement at either of their sentencing hearings. I've heard that some people feel a sense of satisfaction, justice, or closure when those who have harmed them or those they love are sentenced. I felt nothing. The first months after that were a blur. When I was working, whether in the restaurant or on Falcon business, time seemed to fly by. When I wasn't, it slowed to an interminable crawl. The nights were the worst, and sleep was hard to come by. I finally decided that flying by was better than crawling, and worked as much as I could. I was digging a hole in the tea garden to plant a new shrub when my phone rang. "Hello," said a female voice with an accent. French, I thought. "My name is Sophie Sewells. Am I speaking to Mr. Roger Richardson of the Falcon Group?" "Yes, you are," I replied. The name Sewells sounded familiar. "I am calling for Mr. Eamon Sewells. Mr. Sewells would like to meet with you to discuss a partnership opportunity." Eamon Sewells. That name I knew. Multi-billionaire Greek shipping magnate. "Well," I said, "I am not really the person you should be speaking to about a partnership with Falcon. We would prefer to discuss this with you first, for personal reasons." "Oh," I said, unable to think of anything that a billionaire Greek shipping magnate would want to talk with me about for personal reasons. There were a few moments of dead air, and then another voice came on the line. "Mr. Richardson, this is Eamon Sewells. I believe we have a common interest and may be able to be of assistance to one another. Daniel Moore." Timberline Lodge is situated on the south side of Mount Hood, about 60 miles east of Portland. It was built and furnished by local artisans during the Great Depression under the sponsorship of the Works Progress Administration and dedicated on September 28, 1937, by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The lodge is a National Historic Landmark within the Mount Hood National Forest. If you saw Jack Nicholson in Asterisk, The Shining Asterisk, the resort was the exterior of the Overlook Hotel. I checked in 3 days after the call from Eamon Sewells, ostensibly needing to just get away and clear my head of my black cloud of sadness in Rose Valley. I didn't mention to anyone that I'd be meeting someone else there. There was a message waiting for me at the front desk inviting me to dinner at one of the luxury condominiums at the nearby lodge at Government Camp, and the lodge's concierge had arranged for someone to drive me there and back. Upon my arrival, I was greeted by Eamon Sewells, a dapper-looking elderly gentleman. Sophie Sewells, his companion, was a woman a few years older than me who bore no family resemblance whatsoever to Sewells and turned out to be his daughter-in-law. They both insisted we all used first names, and we sat down to be served a sumptuous dinner. All mention of business, whatever that was going to be, was deferred until after the dishes had been cleared away. "Your recent experiences with Daniel Moore are known to us," Eamon finally began. "But I doubt that Sophie's and my experience with the man is known to you. Daniel Moore is responsible for the murder of my son, Armand," Eamon flatly declared, Sophie's husband. Eamon Sewells was a man with a checkered past, the son of a Greek fisherman who had no wish to inherit his father's life. He instead used his small fishing boat to carry cargo, almost none of it legal. In time, he owned a fleet of such boats. In more time, he owned a fleet of freighters and oil tankers. He was ambitious and ruthlessly avaricious in his pursuit of wealth until he met and married his wife, Manon. Manon Sewells was a woman of compassion and charity. In order to win her love, Eamon had to put aside many of his ambitions and become a good man in her eyes. That meant no more illegal shipments, treating his workers, business partners, and even his competitors fairly, and eventually dedicating his vast fortune to attempting to make amends for the worst of his past sins. He funded the Sewells Foundation with a mission to combat poverty and exploitation, and Manon raised their son Andre to share her passion for making that mission a success. Upon Manon's death, the foundation became the Manon Sewells Foundation, and Andre was its chairman. The foundation had become involved in the affairs of San Lawrence, a small, impoverished South American state whose government was negotiating a deal that would fund schools and hospitals for all its citizens, but the cost would be the granting of over 500,000 acres of rainforest to an energy and mining cartel that would, over the next 10 years, deforest almost all the land, turn it from an environmental treasure into a wasteland of oil fields and mining pits, and displace the indigenous tribal peoples who made their homes there. It was truly a deal with the devil, but it was also the needs of the many today versus those of the few in the future. The foundation had submitted a competing proposal to fund those schools and hospitals, not as many as the corporate land deal would provide, but enough to make the destructive land deal unnecessary. The president of the country was receptive, and Andre traveled to San Lawrence to join him for a summit with local officials and tribal leaders. Their aircraft dropped off radar over the rainforest, and soon after, the vice president assumed the presidency. The aircraft's disappearance was blamed on unidentified eco-terrorists. All discussions with the foundation were terminated without explanation. The deal with the cartel was rushed through, and another rainforest was promptly signed away into oblivion. The funder of the energy and mining cartel. More equity partners. You saw that coming too, didn't you? You believe that Daniel Moore assassinated the president of San Lawrence and murdered your son. I certainly had a low opinion of Moore, but this was far beyond my imaginings. I believe the vice president of San Lawrence was the person directly responsible, Eamon replied, but Moore's money was the prize that motivated him. I nodded as I recalled what Jeff had said to our county DA about Moore and the deaths of my daughter and mother-in-law. It had to be his money behind it. I was enraged, Eamon continued. I wanted to crush the life out of all of them. I considered making calls to people I know. His eyes seemed to become lifeless, and I recognized that look. I had seen it a lot in mirrors in recent months. But my Manon would not have approved. My Android would not have approved. And I would not have approved, Sophie added. Sophie made it clear that she would not have Andra's memory sullied by violence, Eamon explained, nor would she allow her children to be near anyone who would do so. He reached into a pocket and handed me a photograph of a boy and a girl both about Mylena's age. Little Eamon and Manon, Eamon told me. Eamon is 5. Manon is 6. If I were to yield to my baser instinct, I have every reason to believe that Sophie might never allow me to see them again. His daughter-in-law said nothing, but the resolute expression on her face told me that that might very well be true. And so we are meeting because, I asked. I had not the slightest concept of where this conversation was going, since, if anything, I had less power to act than they did. Sophie has accepted that I must do something, Eamon explained. But she has insisted that any action I take must be within the law, and may not harm innocents. Ideally, Sophie added, I should like it to be something that might serve as a memorial to my Andre, and perhaps it might also do the same for your loved ones. She handed me a folder with what appeared to be news clippings in it. What Moore is doing to your previous employer is only the most recent of his ventures, she said. The clippings in Sophie's folder told the story of a commercial baker in Illinois, acquired by Moore Equity Partners 6 years ago for $50 million. It had enjoyed unprecedented growth for 3 years that had Moore and his partners on the covers of *Forbes* and *Money*, being hailed as regrowth geniuses, but then had suddenly gone into a massive decline along with the rest of the U.S. economy. It would soon default on its debts, and its assets would be sold for whatever its creditors could recover. More than 300 workers would be rendered jobless just in time for Thanksgiving. There are 2 other companies in condition somewhere between this company's and your Maple Grove Mills, Sophie added. Enough to suggest a pattern, do you not think? I could see what they were suggesting. Acquire a small company, grow it fast, drain it dry, and then walk away, leaving its workers adrift, and, well, out of luck. Anything illegal happening here? I asked. We suspect that the company's early growth was falsified to overvalue assets that could be used to secure loans, Eamon replied. Moore purged the company's finance group shortly after acquiring it and installed his own. But that is conjecture on our part. When the company went under, Moore's people wiped all the company's financial data as they left. So there is no proof. This has already been made public, I observed. The news clippings made that obvious, so you couldn't be thinking that you'd be embarrassing Moore by revealing it. Your idea is to rescue the companies and their employees, Sophie said. More precisely, Eamon corrected, for you to rescue the companies and their employees. Eamon's idea was for someone to step forward, save the company Moore had destroyed, and with words and actions that were diametrically opposed to everything Daniel Moore said and did, go head-to-head against him and spectacularly prove that all his pronouncements about what made a business successful in today's economy were dead wrong by outperforming every venture he was involved in. Eamon and Sophie couldn't do it publicly, either as individuals or through their business or foundation. It would just look like super rich people playing games with companies. But having it be someone who had already taken more on and won, for example in a divorce and child custody case that had pitted a small-town David against a half-dozen of Moore's legal Goliaths in $5,000 suits, would get people's attention. You're assuming that we can actually succeed at this. You and your associates are already assuming that a new business producing quality products with integrity can succeed in the shadow of one that no longer does, Eamon pointed out. Otherwise, you would not be attempting to start one. What we are proposing is to provide you the necessary resources to do this using the assets and the workers of a previously existing one. And if we're wrong, and the company loses money again, it will have the opposite effect to what you want, I observed. The company will not lose money, Eamon replied. We will ensure that it does not. Isn't that what Moore did? I asked pointedly, faking the profits. No, Sophie said. We will not be faking profits. The money will really be there. For how long? As long as it takes to destroy Moore's credibility, Eamon promised, and for you and your associates to have every opportunity to prove your business principles. And this is acceptable to you? I asked Sophie, remembering the moral restrictions she had put on Eamon. We would do nothing illegal, and no innocent people will suffer because of what we do, Eamon pointed out. Investors underwriting business ventures that may not succeed is a common practice, though admittedly we will be taking it to absurd lengths. Even if you eventually fail, hundreds of workers will have their lost jobs back for several years, and we will fund a generous, soft landing for them. So yes, it is within the limits Sophie has set. I'll have to lay this out fully for my associates, I finally declared. There can't be anything held back from them. There were 4 of us in the Falcon group. Marty Ball, my former manager in Maple Grove operations, Lucy Armstrong, who used to be Kathy's manager in finance, Dennis McCoy, formerly the Maple Grove technology manager, and me. We hadn't determined yet what my role in the company might be, other than the person writing the business and marketing plans. We had also asked Jeff and Alex to sit in, since it was expected that if we ever did become a real business, they would be handling our legal affairs. We were sitting at the big round table at the back of the restaurant, reviewing copies of the proposal I had brought back with me from Timberline, and trying not to get them stained with soy sauce and chili oil from the working dinner we were sharing. Wow, Marty said. Just wow. Second that, Lucy said. Dennis nodded. He had just taken a bite of one of Jean's new deep-fried creations that I had yet to sample or figure out a cute menu name for. Is this legal? Lucy asked. Not in a publicly traded company, Alex mused. But when you're privately owned, the rules are different. As long as you're not making false claims, especially to lenders or investors, Sewell's is right, it's legal. It does seem to answer the question of what your role in Falcon would be, Roger, Marty observed. Yeah, I agreed. Figurehead frontman. Clay pigeon and sitting duck, Jeff grumbled. If Sewell's is right about what happened to his son. There is that, Marty conceded. But I was thinking that Roger is doing our business and marketing plans, and we still don't have anyone heading up either business development or sales and marketing. I figured Roger would run both of those, Dennis said with a shrug. At least until we got big enough to need 2 people for them. I mean, he's the one with the MBA. But that was for a startup cooperative. Lucy asked, would it scale up for something like this? This company was like Maple Grove before they were acquired, I pointed out. They already had people in these roles. Suppose some new owner called us and said, come home and help us put Maple Grove back the way it was. Wouldn't we all go back? Saving companies like Maple Grove and the jobs of a lot of people sounds great, Jeff argued. But let's not forget Sewell's real goal here. He wants to ruin Moore's credibility in the business world. You've all experienced what Moore is capable of when people he sees as his peasants do anything more than disagree with him at the office. What's he going to do if this scheme works and he starts seeing the 4 of you as a threat? Especially you, Roger. You're the one Sewell's wants standing in the spotlight, while he keeps himself and his family safe in the shadows. A pall settled over the table. Jeff had left it unsaid, but it was no secret to anyone there that he suspected that what had happened to Lana and Nancy hadn't been entirely accidental, even before hearing about Eamon's son and the president of San Lawrence. I guessed that Jeff was seeing Sewell's as just another wealthy individual looking for people he could use for his own ends. Of course, we said yes. Otherwise, I wouldn't be telling you this story. We did address the concerns that had been raised during that first dinner in a counter-proposal, and the 4 of us, plus Jeff and Alex, made the trek to Mount Hood again to meet with Eamon and Sophie Sewell's to hammer out the details. Falcon Associates was formed as a New Mexico Anonymous LLC. Why New Mexico? Because it's the one state where a truly anonymous LLC can be formed, with the identities of the owners not revealed even to the state government. Jeff and Alex would continue to represent Dan, Lucy, Dennis, and me as our personal attorneys, while the New Mexico attorney, an old friend of Alex's who had no other ties to any of us, would serve as corporate counsel. The four of us held 50% of the LLC while Eamon and Sophie held the other 50%, ensuring that neither we nor they held a controlling majority, and the four of us signed a mutual agreement that we would not vote on anything unless we could do it as a unified block. To anyone outside the inner circle of the LLC, Dan, Lucy, Dennis, and I would be presented as employees of Falcon Associates. Dan would be Director of Operations, Lucy Director of Finance, Dennis Director of Technology, and my title would be Managing Director. The discussion of whether I would be just the official talking figurehead or actually directing business development and marketing was shelved until we determined what resources we might find available in the companies we were going to try to rebuild. We would each draw the same salary of $250,000 per year, generous compensation, but not entirely out of the range of credibility for a high-risk startup, with a conventional set of executive benefits for ourselves and our families. What was unconventional was what was added to address Jeff's concerns about safety. We and our families would have a 24/7 hotline to an executive security firm that could provide armed security anytime it was needed. Lucy and Dennis would keep out of the public view as much as they could because they had spouses and children. And if things did go worst case, we would each have $10 million life insurance policies. A week after we signed the agreements, Eamon informed us that our salaries and benefits were active and that Falcon Associates now had working capital of $100 million with an additional capital reserve of another $100 million. Lucy nearly hyperventilated when a courier delivered the verified financial statement. It was probably only a small portion of Eamon's wealth, but it was more money than any of us had imagined we'd ever have access to. 3 weeks later, the Illinois Baking Company shut its doors, throwing 316 workers onto the unemployment rolls. The bankruptcy trustee would begin entertaining offers for the company's assets within the next 30 days. Falcon Associates, LLC announces successful bid to purchase assets of Pathway Bakeries, Incorporated, Albuquerque, New Mexico, December 3, 2011. AP Newswire first call via Comex Newsnet. Falcon Associates, LLC today announced that the U.S. Bankruptcy Court for the District of Delaware has approved Falcon's bid to purchase substantially all of the assets of Pathway Bakeries, Incorporated of Kelton, Illinois. Under the terms of the asset purchase agreement, Falcon will acquire substantially all of the assets of Pathway for approximately $28 million. The transaction is expected to close no later than December 15, 2011. Falcon will use private capital investments to fund the acquisition. "We're excited about this acquisition," commented Roger Richardson, Managing Director of Falcon LLC. "We are looking forward to reopening the Kelton, Illinois production facility, where we intend to produce Pathway products. In our opinion, the old Pathway's last owners cultivated a toxic business culture that placed profits above people and quality and eventually led to the company's demise," Richardson said, then added, "It is our intention to forge cooperative and mutually respectful relationships between management, employees, suppliers, and customers, and build a new Pathway that we can all be proud of." Source: Falcon Associates, LLC. Take that, Daniel Moore. Buying the assets of a bankrupted business is an incredibly complicated process. You don't just breeze into a trustee's office, lay down a pile of money, and walk away with the ownership papers. If you're not an expert at steering your way through an endless maze of red tape and legal landmines, don't even try doing it yourself. Find someone with the necessary expertise to do it for you, which is what we had our New Mexico counsel do. Kelton Record Chicago Tribune, Monday, December 6, 2011. Tiny Kelton has been struggling. Illinois has lost over 130,000 manufacturing jobs since the recession began in 2007. The outlook in Kelton became especially bleak in early October when the Pathway Bakeries plant was closed by its out-of-state owner, More Equity Partners, Workers at the bakery said they felt betrayed when Moore at first said there would be more work in a day or two, but then changed the locks. Raina and Andy Dean were both thrown out of jobs. They just kept taking and taking until there was nothing left to take, Raina said. And they didn't care that they were putting 300 people out of work. How can they do that? Andy added, this was a good company, a good place to work. They come in from nowhere and destroy it. How can you destroy people's lives just to make a profit? And with Christmas now only 3 weeks away, some 300-plus Kelton families are looking at bleak holidays after nearly 2 months of unemployment. This week, displaced pathway workers learned that the shuttered plant that used to be their place of work had been acquired by another private equity firm, Falcon Associates, LLC of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Falcon has said it intends to reopen the plant and will hold a public meeting in the Kelton High School auditorium at 7 p.m. on Friday, December 10th to present their plans to the community. Showtime, Dan said as he handed me a bottle of water. You ready? Prepared, I said nervously as I looked out through the curtain. Don't know about ready. The Kelton High School auditorium had 600 seats. Every seat was filled. The sides and back were packed, and it looked as if there were people overflowing into the halls outside. The seats had been reserved for former Pathway employees, and each had been handed an envelope with his or her name on it and asked not to open it until told to. We had brought 316 envelopes, one for every person on the list of employees who had lost their jobs the previous month, and every single one had been claimed. Looks like some of them brought their families with them, I observed. Most of them, I think, Dan agreed, and invited their relatives from the Chicago Tribune and CNN, too. I groaned. Well, we wanted to make a splash, didn't we? What do you think? I asked. Go out through the curtain or walk on from the side of the stage? Curtain feels like I'm a big star trying to make an entrance. Seems like something more would do. Side, Dan agreed. Definitely side. There's a podium out there, I noticed. I'm not going to stand behind that and lecture them. I took a last swig from the water bottle, and we headed out onto the stage. The podium had a microphone on it, thankfully a wireless one, so I pulled it off its socket and walked up to the front of the stage. Hello, everyone, I said, and thank you all for coming tonight. I'm Roger Richardson, Managing Director of Falcon, and this is Marty Ball, our Director of Operations. Those of you who previously worked for Pathway Incorporated were given envelopes when you arrived. Would you please open yours now? We waited while envelopes were torn open all around the auditorium, and the enclosed letters with their attached bits of plastic were withdrawn and examined. Then there was the sound of gasps, and even a few shrieks as people read the title on the letters and realized what they were holding. Hiring letters. We wish we could call you all in to work in time for Christmas, I explained. But the reality is that between the way previous management neglected equipment and facilities and the fact that the plant has now been closed for almost 2 months, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to bring Pathway back online. Another dig at Moore there. We've staged the report to work schedule in 2-week intervals over the next 2 months. If your letter says you're in the first hiring round, the main gate and building 1 will be open Monday morning at 8 o'clock. There was a round of applause and cheers from the audience. Health insurance benefits for everyone went back online at noon today. If you haven't sent your COBRA papers in yet, there's no need to. Another cheer. Direct deposit of pay will resume right after the new year. All salaries and seniorities will be preserved. Attached to your rehire letters are Visa debit cards. Each of these cards has been preloaded with $1,500. They're activated by going to the website or calling the toll-free number on the letter and entering your social security numbers. We hope this will help make the holiday and the rest of the year a little brighter for everyone. There were gasps and scattered, "Oh my gods," and the audience sat stunned for a few moments, then burst into a huge round of cheers and applause. Some actually cried. There's a buffet in the gym, I said to complete my remarks. Please join us and enjoy. Thank you again for coming, and welcome to what we hope will be a much better pathway than the one you knew at the beginning of this year. Yeah, I couldn't resist taking one more little poke there. The official meeting was followed by interviews with various reporters. Mostly, I just expressed the same views we had previously based our nascent grain cooperative proposals on as I talked about how the new pathway would succeed on high quality, integrity, and just doing the right thing, and took advantage of every opportunity to point out how Pathway's previous owners had not. We spent the remainder of the evening meeting and shaking hands with our soon-to-be new employees and their families. I looked into the eyes of people who just a few weeks ago had been looking at a hopeless future and saw hope. I hadn't seen much of that lately. I wanted to see more. You think any of this is getting back to more? Marty asked as we headed for our hotel. Not a clue, I admitted, but it feels pretty darn good. Yeah, Marty agreed. There is that. Rising from the ashes, Falcon gives displaced Pathway workers $1,500 gifts. December 12, 2011. Kelton Record Chicago Tribune. A company reopening the former Pathway Bakery in Kelton, Illinois, stunned displaced employees by presenting them with $1,500 Visa gift cards. Albuquerque, New Mexico-based Falcon Associates will begin operations next week at the former Pathway plant with a staff of 70. More than 300 employees lost their jobs when Pathway filed for bankruptcy in October. Falcon says it hopes to have all employees back on the job by the end of February. Mary Gladden, a worker at the bakery, had been preparing her children for a very modest holiday. They said they understood. Gladden recalls, "You always want to give them more. But I didn't think I would be able to. Now she can. I was crying." Gladden says of the gift, "Who are these people? They don't know me. They don't know any of the Pathway people. And they come and do this." Each former Pathway employee received a gift card at a meeting Friday at the Kelton High School. "We are a new company," Falcon Managing Director Roger Richardson told the Kelton Record. "We don't have a history people just can look up. These are the folks we are depending on for our future success. They suffered a lot under the old Pathways owners, and we want them to know that we are not the same as the people who did that to them." Falcon Associates, LLC's debut in the business world, made a splash nationwide when it was picked up by AP and Reuters. Cell phone videos taken by some of the Pathway people who attended the meeting were posted to YouTube and Facebook, and one of them was used in a CNN report. The last week of December was full of catchy headlines. Pathway rises from the ashes. Santa comes to Kelton. Miracle on Kelton Boulevard. Someone labeled a photo of me, the new George Bailey. Best of all were the side stories about the fall of the old Pathway, the shuttering of its plants, and how its former workers were facing a Christmas without jobs or health insurance until Falcon came along, illustrated with the face of Daniel Moore labeled Mr. Potter, Ebenezer Moore, and my personal favorite, Scrooge McMoore. Inevitably, the media focus became, who are these people? Searching for information about us turned up the usual social media and professional credentials for all of us. In the story of my divorce from Kathy, her marriage to Daniel Moore, and the events leading to the deaths of Lana and Nancy, I declined all requests to discuss my personal tragedy with interviewers. But we had made me the face of Falcon, knowing that someone would dig the story out on their own and run it anyway. And how could they not? It was an irresistible real-life soap opera. Arrogant millionaire takes over small town's biggest employer and fires a third of its hapless workers. Arrogant millionaire seduces and steals the pretty young wife of one of the hapless fired workers. Arrogant millionaire and the faithless pretty young wife go to divorce court and try to steal the hapless fired worker's little girl from him and fail. Their army of high-priced lawyers in $5,000 suits defeated by a small-town country lawyer who is the fiercely protective older brother of the hapless fired worker. The faithless pretty young ex-wife of the hapless fired worker tries to kidnap their little girl and ends up getting both her daughter and her own mother killed. run down by one of her new husband's trucks, a lumbering symbol of the wealthy running roughshod over the little people who stand in the path of what they covet. Instead of crumbling under the heavy weight of this loss, the hapless fired worker joins with other hapless fired workers to start a new company, and 6 months later they come to the rescue of another company's hapless fired workers who were thrown out of work by the same arrogant millionaire and hand out $1,500 gift cards, bringing them hope for the coming year and saving Christmas for them all. You can't make this stuff up. Some of the stories were hard to watch. Especially difficult was the human interest story that started in front of the Maple Grove Mills plant, then moved to the front gate of the Coffee Creek Correctional Facility in Wilsonville, where Kathy was serving her sentence for manslaughter, and finally ended standing on the spot in front of Richardson's garden, where Lana and Nancy were run down. I had to turn it off when the reporter went snooping around inside the restaurant and showed the little family altar in the back where Mom burns incense in front of little framed photos of my grandparents, Dad, Lana, and Nancy. Jeff swore he wasn't behind a reporter and camera crew who ambushed Moore coming out the front door of his holiday-festooned high-rise condo building in downtown L.A., and asked him if abducting Lana and assaulting Nancy had been his idea, and if he felt any responsibility for their deaths and his wife's current incarceration. Moore screamed something that was mostly unintelligible, but I thought I made out failing and losers. It was the sharpest jab anyone had scored on the man yet, so if Jeff did whisper something in someone's ear, I guess I can live with that. The answer to the question of whether I'd just be the mouthpiece for the new pathway or be hands-on with business development, marketing, and sales turned out to be yes. As I had anticipated, Pathway's previous, non-Moore managers were eager to return, but they needed some hand-holding to make a transition from merely thinking about restoring the old pathway to building a new pathway that could fill consumer needs and markets that had existed either barely or not at all when Moore had acquired their company 6 years ago. And even though the Falcon strategy had been formulated by all four of us with input from fired Maple Grove marketing analysts who we hired as consultants, as the person who had stood on a stage before the entire company handed out those $1,500 Christmas gift cards and made all those statements about how we'd all build the new company together, it fell to me to make the pitches that would fire up people's enthusiasm. It ended up taking 4 months to get the shuttered Pathway plant up to full working order. Part of the delay was because Moore and his people had utterly neglected just about everything required to keep it running. There were numerous safety violations that had to be corrected, loads of deferred maintenance on equipment, and some equipment that flat out had to be removed and replaced. This included the offices as well. Every computer was at least 4 years old, so we just replaced them all. Dennis removed the hard drives from every decommissioned workstation, laptop, and server and stored them for a secret data project. More about that later. And then we donated everything else to the local school system and to various local nonprofits. We upgraded our rehired people as well. After the first of the year, every employee who was not yet called back to full-time work was signed up for some kind of training. Some updated their skills for their current jobs, while others learned new skills that would enable them to handle the new equipment we were adding, such as robots. Are these robots going to mean job cuts? The union rep on our new management board asked. The plan is not fewer people, Marty explained, but higher output using the same number of people. The company we used to work for maintained essentially the same headcount on the floors for over 30 years. But in that time, we more than doubled our output. No growth? One of the finance reps asked. Not in headcount, Marty replied. But in everything else, yes, there was growth. The population of our little town didn't change significantly either, I pointed out. Some people said the company and town were stagnant. We called it stability. They had layoffs, the union rep pointed out. It was a purge, I said, making no effort to mask my bitterness. They swept out everyone who had opposed their takeover of the company and wasn't willing to be a team player as they turned the place to ruins. There were nods all around. Are you confident we can sell twice as much Pathway product as we used to after what happened to our quality the past few years? Asked a marketing rep. Not right away, I admitted. Not until we can show customers we lost that the old Pathway quality is back. Pathway is back, and even better than you remember it, is going to have to be the basis of our customer outreach for some time on the old standbys. But we aren't going to just sell the old Pathway standbys. We're lining up some private label contracts that will keep the floor humming. And there are new product categories Pathway can move into. Organics, high-end sugar-frees, gluten, and grain-free. These weren't significant markets when Moore management took over and they ignored them. But demand is starting to grow, and we can help it. We're not going to just stop ignoring change and start keeping pace with it. We're going to be part of it. If you follow this business, you probably already know that the U.S. market for gluten-free products grew more than 60% during the 4 years that followed this conversation. The new Pathway GF product line we introduced in the summer of 2012 brought in nearly a third of our total revenue and cemented my image as a prophet in the eyes of Pathway's marketing group. Meanwhile, the new Maple Grove Mills, having fired all those marketing analysts we were using as consultants, totally missed the explosion in gluten-free product sales. The first year of the new Pathway was, for me, a lot like the months I had worked on the Falcon cooperative, but on a much larger scale. Instead of driving all over Oregon and southern Washington developing new relationships with suppliers, distributors, and retailers, which I maintained as we added them to Pathway's list of potential business partners, I was flying all over the U.S. to work on both new and renewed relationships for Pathway. In many cases, the renewals were with businesses the old Pathway had alienated with poor quality products, late shipments, short shipments, billings for shipments never delivered, and non-payments for deliveries received. Even though we had rehired Pathway's marketing team and sales reps, everyone, and I do mean everyone, seemed to want to hear Pathway's new managing director personally repeat the promise that the people who had ruined their good relations with old Pathway as they ran the company into the ground were gone for good. And of course, I never missed an opportunity to stress that the old Pathway was more, and our new Pathway was not. My cross-country public relations tour seemed to have a beneficial effect. Before long, our sales reps were reporting rising orders for returning products. We also signed several contracts to produce and package store-branded products that were similar, but not identical, to what we sold under our own brand. You might think that would have us competing with ourselves on grocers' shelves. But since we weren't spending any of our own money to distribute store-branded products, they were shipped to the store chain's main warehouses, and distribution to their retail outlets was their responsibility, or to advertise them. Our net revenue per unit was actually pretty close to that of our own Pathway-branded product. Our business plan was starting to work. We held 2 meetings every quarter. The quarterly Pathway meeting was an all-hands for the entire company, the senior management in the company boardroom, and the rest of the company able to log into a secure web meeting using their employee ID numbers. As a privately held company, Pathway wasn't legally required to conduct such meetings, but we had promised openness, and we delivered. The quarterly Falcon meeting was closed door. Marty, Lucy, Dennis, and I in the boardroom. Eamon, Sophie, and Phil Barnes, our New Mexico corporate counsel on web. Alex and Jeff logged in as well, but generally were silent observers unless they heard something that they needed to weigh in on as our personal attorneys. As the majority shareholder, Eamon should have been our chair, but as he and Sophie had declared themselves silent partners in all matters except those directly related to Daniel Moore, the task of chairing the meetings rotated between the 4 of us who were on site at Pathway. Call to order, Lucy declared. It was our 3rd meeting, the 1-year anniversary of the signing of the Falcon Associates Partner Agreement, 1 month remaining before the Q4 Pathway meeting, and it was her turn at bat. Move to waive minutes of last meeting, she asked. So moved, I said. Second, Marty added. Objections? There were none. Updates from last meeting. We spent an hour going through our usual list: sales, plant performance and upgrades, employee morale, technology projects, etc. Last item, Lucy said as she hit the key to put her PowerPoint slide on the screen. Financials. There was silence. We were stunned. Pathway will end Q4 in the black. That's a year ahead of your projection, Eamon noted. How? The Champion Markets contract, Lucy explained. We're providing their entire line of store-branded hard-baked snack foods. And it was unplanned. Unplanned. I met their CEO at the Grocers Association show in Vegas in February and gave him the full private label supplier pitch. I explained. He was cagey about their plans at the time. But in March, they announced a 7-state expansion into the Southwest. By the end of Q2, they had 20 new stores open, and their existing supplier was overloaded doing both breads and pastries and hard-baked snacks. So now that supplier has transitioned to doing just fresh-baked, and we're doing all their hards, nobody lost any work. So there's been no change in product that customers will notice. It's a 1-year deal with options, and the new Champion stores have been doing well, I added. So it's looking good for sustainability. The new Pathway's first holiday party was December 21, 2012, our last working day of the year. The company provided the basics: turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, salad, soft drinks, and some desserts. Everybody was invited to bring potluck dishes, and just about everybody did. Families and children were invited. Someone dressed up as Santa. No, not me. And we used the projector in the conference room to screen It's a Wonderful Life *. While no adults were looking, I taught some of the younger kids that Mr. Potter's first name was Daniel. Never miss an opportunity. After the gift exchange, everyone was told not to spend more than $20, and gag gifts were encouraged. We did a drawing with some better stuff as prizes, then brought out takeout containers so people could divide up what was left of the company-supplied food. We had brought in a lot, and it was time to bid everyone farewell until next year. Before everybody heads off for the holiday, we want you to know how much we've appreciated your efforts this year as we've worked to build our new Pathway, I announced, and to let you know that when your last checks of the year are deposited or mailed to you, there will be a little something extra in them. Applause. Everyone applauds Christmas bonuses, right? It's going to be the same amount for everyone, I continued. And it's not a Christmas bonus. It's profit sharing. Rising from the ashes, Falcon distributes profit-sharing checks to Pathway workers. December 24, 2012. Kelton Record. Business page. A cheer rose up at the first holiday party of the newly reborn Pathway Bakeries when the managing director of the company's parent company, Falcon Associates of Albuquerque, New Mexico, announced a profit-sharing bonus at the end of the company's first year in business. The Record has learned that each worker received $500. Pathway currently employs 325 full-time workers. As a privately held company, we do not comment on earnings, Falcon Managing Director Roger Richardson told the Kelton Record. Pathway's workers all gave 100% and more this past year, and Falcon has decided to show appreciation for that support by distributing the entirety of this first year's profits equally to all employees. We look forward to the coming year as we continue to build a new Pathway on the ruins left by the owners of its predecessor. Never, ever miss an opportunity. The next round of our war of words against Daniel Moore and Moore Equity Partners came from an unexpected source. The termination of 150 employees of the Maple Grove Mills had had a noticeable impact on business in Rose Valley, especially the more discretionary income-based businesses like restaurants. We used some of my Falcon salary to make sure all the restaurants' bills got paid, and with family benefits, Mom had company-paid health insurance. We even covered my cousin Jin by declaring him a member of my household, since he was related, lived upstairs from his kitchen, and our restaurant, apartments, and houses were all part of the same family compound. It's good to be one of the bosses. A month after the party at which we announced profit sharing for Pathway employees, Jeff called me about a strangeness Mom had experienced at Richardson's Garden. Longtime customers who were still employed at Maple Grove were no longer coming in, but longtime customers who had been fired were, and they were buying a lot more takeout than they used to. It turned out that the fired employees were picking up food for their friends and relatives who were still working at the mills, because mill management had removed Richardson's Garden from the company's list of approved vendors for catering and suggested to employees that there would be repercussions if they continued to patronize the restaurant. Rumor was this had happened in early January and had resulted from an executive meeting in which a screaming, tantrum-throwing Daniel Moore reportedly shouted that he would ruin those chinks. I relayed Mum's discovery to Eamon and Sophie, and Eamon, in his role as the architect of Falcon's Moore strategy, called for a teleconference. I think we're getting to him, I observed. Yeah, Jeff agreed. I would not want to unduly frighten anyone, Eamon said. But if Moore has targeted your mother's business, perhaps it's time to talk about security. Gray Bear Security had a knack for dispatching people with multiple skill sets, and unlike the obvious men in black tights you typically see escorting heads of state or corporate CEOs, they fit right in with their surroundings and became invisible. They didn't just pose as what they appeared to be, they actually were what they appeared to be, with the added dimension of being trained to be very effective bodyguards if the need arose. Richardson's Garden hired a new waiter for the restaurant. He also started driving for Mom, so she wouldn't have to waste her time looking for parking. He was a polite fellow by the name of Duke, pronounced Duke Lee, no relation to us, who was actually several years older than he appeared to be, and was a retired Navy Chief Petty Officer with experience running the galley on a nuclear attack submarine. According to Mom, Duke was a very good waiter and driver. He moved into a spare room in Mom's house, so he'd be there if she fell and couldn't get up. Eamon made some phone calls, and a TV chef whose show traveled the country visiting eateries in small-town America came to Rose Valley. He made stops at the local breakfast house, the craft brewery, the artisan baker whose praise of the stone-ground flour he used led to a visit to its source, a historic grist mill across the Columbia River in Washington. The TV crew made a point of showing the chef driving past the Maple Grove Mills but not going there. And of course, Richardson's Garden. Mom and Jin pulled out all the stops and wowed their visitor with exotic selections from the secret Chinese menu that she and Jin created just in time for the shoot. The show made Richardson's Garden a minor gourmet dining destination, and the out-of-towner traffic made up for a lot of the business lost due to the Maple Grove purge. Word soon came to us that Moore had started throwing things when it got back to him that Richardson's Garden not only didn't appear to be suffering from his attempted embargo, but had actually expanded its staff. Alex and Jeff hired a new paralegal for their office, a deputy from another county who was laid off when its voters chose not to approve a bond, and was working security while studying law part-time. The company had tuition benefits. She was renting a room in the home of Alex and his wife Chris, who were empty nesters, and she and Alex drove to and from work together, stopping along the way to pick up or drop off Jeff to save on gas. Marty, Lucy, and Dennis decided to forego full-time security in the absence of overt signs of danger, but a new person was added to the Pathway Security Department and assigned to a station near the executive offices. The Armstrong and McCoy families hired a nanny who split her workday between the two families and drove all their children to and from school because of how busy Lucy and Dennis were working out of their homes. And I hired an executive assistant. Rebecca Sullivan was a former Navy Inco who had been assigned to Naval Station Norfolk when a superior officer started making inappropriate advances. She attempted to deal with the situation through channels, and he attempted to put her in her place. She had put him in his place, which turned out to be a bed in the Naval Medical Center in Portsmouth. There was talk of a court-martial for assaulting a superior officer, which led to talk of press conferences and lawsuits for harassment and attempted assault, which led to 2 discharges. Hers had been honorable, his somewhat less than. Her slightly evil look of satisfaction when she recounted her story to Marty and me told us that we had similar attitudes about people who try to abuse positions of power. "She's perfect for you," Marty told me after we had handed Rebecca off to Maureen, the executive admin we had been sharing since the Pathway takeover. Did you see her eyes when she talked about putting that brass jerk on his back? That's exactly how you look when you talk about more. I had never had either a bodyguard or an executive assistant before, and didn't have the faintest idea what would constitute one who was perfect for me. But everyone who dealt with Rebecca was impressed by the way she handled the executive assistant part of her job. I wasn't especially eager to find out how good a bodyguard she was. Rebecca and Dave Simpson, the new executive office guard, each moved into one-bedroom condos, which they said were more than enough for their needs, in the same complex where Marty and I were each leasing a two-bedroom unit. Marty and Dave hung out together a lot off hours and rideshare to and from work, and while Rebecca and I didn't pal around outside of the office, we did also share rides, and yes, we told everyone it was to save on gas. Rebecca's arrival also solved another staffing issue for us. Maureen, the executive admin who had been supporting both Marty and me, had previously worked for Pathway's general manager, who had developed serious health issues fighting to keep Pathway from failing under Moore's destructive reign, and had chosen to take a pension rather than return. Marty had been seeing a woman he'd met in Kelton for some time, and was now calling Kelton home, and our consensus was that he should become the Pathway general manager. So Maureen should rightly have been working solely for Marty, and I really did need someone to support me on the many cross-country expeditions that constituted more than two-thirds of my duties as managing director of Falcon Associates, and whom knew what was really going on behind the scenes. "How much do you know about what we do here?" I asked her. "Not very much about Pathway," she replied. "About Falcon, everything. Everything. Gray Bear Security is a subsidiary of Global Maritime Protection Services," she explained, "which is owned by the Sewell Shipping Group." Of course, I should have seen that coming, shouldn't I? The rest of Q1 2013 was uneventful. Financials continued to improve each month, and if we could maintain this pace, we'd be a $10 million company by the end of the year. That may sound like phenomenal growth, but you have to consider that the old Pathway had been a $10 million company before Moore did and yelled at it. So all we were really doing was a decent job of restoring what Moore had ruined, and we had spent some $60 million to get there. But as far as accomplishing our other mission, the biggest result we could point to so far was getting Daniel Moore angry enough to enact a failed embargo on a Chinese restaurant in a small Oregon town. We would need to take things to a new level. That opportunity was soon presented to us. Westover Foods Incorporated, Phil Barnes said as we looked at the slide he put up at our Q1 Falcon meeting, maker of Marvel Bread and Happy Brand snack cakes. Its management has been sucking money out of it while staving off bankruptcy, mostly by squeezing concessions out of their employee union in exchange for promising to maintain the pension fund. This month, they reneged on the pension fund, which violates their contract. If the union refuses to accept contract changes, the company will go under, but they'll have their pension fund. If they accept, the company will go under anyway, and then they'll have no pension fund. "Bankruptcy sounds inevitable," Lucy said. "Union members voted down a new contract by 92% last week," Phil confirmed. "There are two asset acquisition bids in, one on Happy and one on Marvel," Phil noted. "The Happy bidder is from a global conglomerate and is $680 million. That one's a done deal. The Marvel bid is $30 million. The sole bidder is More Equity Partners. Can't imagine the union will like that," Dennis said. "They don't," Phil agreed, "which is why they approached me with an overture to Falcon. They like what you're doing with Pathway. If you do the same with Marvel, they'll make significant concessions on compensation until the new company's on its feet. And they'll have their pension fund money from Westover," Lucy added. "Bidding against Moore would definitely take things to a new level," I commented. "Do we know what it would take to outbid Moore?" Eamon asked. "Moore's bid was presented as a take-it-or-leave-it offer," Phil replied. "He's made some loud public statements about Marvel being a piece of crap loser company and how he's the only one who will ever bid on it because nobody else could ever fix it. So we make him look bad just by trying to buy Marvel after he predicted that nobody else would, I reasoned. And even if we don't outbid him, we make him go back on his take it or leave it ultimatum and spend more money to buy it. The question is, if we do buy it, are we positioned to save another company? Falcon Associates, LLC purchases assets of Marvel Bread from Westover Foods. Albuquerque, New Mexico, April 9, 2013 Food Business News. Falcon Associates, LLC. Albuquerque, New Mexico, DBA Pathway Bakeries of Kelton, Illinois, has emerged as the buyer for a number of the Marvel Bread Company assets of Westover Foods, Incorporated, according to a January 28 filing in the U.S. Bankruptcy Court for the Southern District of New York. Under the agreement, Falcon will pay $43.85 million in cash for the Marvel Bread Companies, Marvel, Pioneer Trail, Montana Heritage, and Psycha Sordo brands, 4 baking plants, 11 depots, and other assets. The 5 baking plants are located in Portland, Oregon, Spokane, Washington, Billings, Montana, and Anchorage, Alaska. The 11 depots are located in Portland, Oregon, Haven, Idaho Falls, Montpelier, Pocatello, and Twin Falls, Idaho, Billings, Montana, Bismarck, North Dakota, and Spokane, Everett, and Tacoma, Washington. The acquisition of Westover Foods Marvel Bread Company assets will enable us to expand the distribution of Pathway Bakeries brand products into the Pacific Northwest and to add new lines of fresh-baked products to the existing Pathway family of products and expand their current Northwest distribution to the Midwest region. Falcon Managing Director Roger Richardson told Food Business News, "We welcome the employees of Marvel Bread to Falcon." A week after the Q1 Pathway meeting, we flew into Portland to conduct the first all-employee meeting of the new Marvel Bread. Gray Bear Security made all our travel and hotel arrangements. There was some joking about the legend that certain executives of the Coca-Cola bottling company are not allowed to travel together in order to safeguard the secret Coca-Cola formula. It's not true, by the way. But a limo was more convenient than the 5 of us lugging our own baggage and hoping that a rental car company wouldn't lose our reservation. So when we deplaned and exited the security perimeter at Portland International, we were met by a couple of men in black tights. One of them collected our baggage claim stubs and went off with a skycap to collect our luggage, while the other escorted us to a sinister-looking black SUV that turned out to be rather luxuriously appointed inside. And once we and our bags had been loaded, we were off to our hotel. The Marvel meetings were a different affair from our dramatic Pathway debut. Westover had obtained permission from its bankruptcy court to liquidate assets without having to shut down all its plants, not because they cared a whit about their workers, but because the facilities and equipment would be worth more if maintained in good working order instead of being idled, and the unions had been the one to initiate our involvement in the first place, so they had a pretty good idea what we were going to say to them about the value of quality products and business integrity. They just wanted to look us in the eyes as we said it. Half of Marvel's 430 workers were able to do that in person in a meeting hall in Portland. The other half did it over video conferencing in their workplaces in Alaska, Idaho, Montana, and Washington. We delivered our prepared remarks and handily fielded questions about our current success with Pathway and our plans to have both Marvel and Pathway products being distributed in all the market areas served by both. But I think the thing that confirmed success in my mind was the reaction from the employees when I told them that the 4 of us had grown up in Oregon eating Marvel's Pioneer Trail honey butter bread, and we were going to do everything humanly possible to make sure it never went away. We spent the rest of the day meeting with the department managers of the Portland plant. Then it was back into the air for a whirlwind tour of the Anchorage, Spokane, and Billings plants to meet with their managers and staff. Marty returned to Kelton at the end of the week, and the rest of us flew back to Portland, where we were picked up again by our rolling palace for the trip south to Rose Valley. Lucy and Dennis telecommuted from Rose Valley, flying into Illinois for a few days every couple of weeks to meet with the Pathway managers who reported to them. and were happy to be going home. Me? Not so much. Mom and I talked just about every day over Skype, but my extended time out of state had made me realize that even before Pathway, I had been spending as much time as I could on the road for our grain cooperative startup, because whenever I was in Rose Valley, I started to sink into my memories of all the bad things that had happened there. And every visit back seemed like another plunge into the abyss. My hope for this visit was that bringing my executive assistant and a lot of Marvel-related work with me would keep my mind focused on the present. Spend time with family, work, keep busy. I wondered what Mom's reaction would be when Rebecca insisted on using the second bedroom in my apartment over the restaurant, but I guess Rebecca was sufficiently businesslike that the idea of anything other than business happening never occurred to Mom. Or maybe Mom just decided that after what had happened with Kathy, a new woman sharing my space might just be a good thing. If you and my mother were thinking Rebecca and I were going to end up sleeping together, you were right. But, as the saying goes, it wasn't what you were thinking. I woke up to the unfamiliar feeling of a warm body pressed against mine. I sat up with a start and realized Rebecca was lying next to me. Rebecca. I was under the covers in my underwear. She was on top of the covers, fully dressed in a t-shirt and sweatpants. "Morning," Rebecca said with a yawn. "What are you doing here?" "I heard you cry out during the night," she explained, shaking her head to get her hair out of her face. "You were shouting your daughter's name, then your ex-wife's name. I grabbed on and held you until it passed. Then you did it all over again, and I figure I should just stay with you." She motioned toward the nightstand on her side of the bed, where her holstered gun was resting. I remembered. Rebecca was using my second bedroom, so she could be close by, just in case. "I was back in the hospital," I explained. "My daughter was in a coma, surrounded by all those machines, with tubes in her arms and all over her face. Alarms kept going off, people kept running in, and making me wait outside the room. It happened over and over again. And then the doctor came and told me she was gone." "Has this happened before?" she asked. "The dream, yes," I admitted. "It happens a lot. Don't know about the shouting. There's never been anyone with me when it happened. The worst is when I'm—" I couldn't say it. "Here?" she asked. I nodded. "It wasn't just a dream," Rebecca said. "It was more like some kind of panic attack. You need to talk to someone about this. You may have PTSD." We were sitting in the back of the dining room going over the notes from our Marvel meetings. Jen makes these great soup dumplings, big, pillowy envelopes of chewy dough filled with meat, shrimp, cabbage, and a spicy broth. Keep your oatmeal, your meatloaf, and your mac and cheese. This is comfort food. Rebecca looked across the table at me, as if she was trying to decide whether to say what was on her mind, and just couldn't decide. "How do you do this?" she finally asked. "No idea," I said in between bites. "This is Jen's recipe." "No, I mean this," she said, gesturing at a video of one of the meetings that was playing on her laptop screen. "You find these people whose lives have been crushed, bring their jobs back from the dead, stand up in front of them, talk to them, and help them see a path to the future. You give them hope, and then you climb into your bed and relive the worst experience of your life over and over again. Where is your hope?" I didn't have an answer. The rest of my visit to Rose Valley was uncomfortable. Everywhere I looked, there was a bad memory. The house where I had grown up and later lived with Kathy and Lana. The school where I had dropped Lana off every day on my way to work. The park up the street where we had taken Lana to play. The restaurant where Nancy and Lana met with Kathy that terrible day. And worst of all, the street outside the restaurant's front door, where Nancy and Lana had been run down and killed by an enormous new Maple Grove Mills semi, while Nancy tried to stop Kathy from taking Lana. When the limo returned to take us back to the airport, Mom hugged me and cried. I think at that moment we both knew that no matter how many times I might come back to visit from now on, Rose Valley just wasn't my hometown anymore. Rebecca was right. I needed to talk to someone. When you're the managing director of a company that's made a big splash in the news and have gotten your face on the cover of Fortune seeing a doctor for a possible traumatic stress-related condition is more complicated than just picking a name off your company health insurance plan's list of preferred providers and calling for an appointment. Never mind the fact that everything Falcon did was the result of 4 people thrashing out ideas on an equal basis, and I was just the front man. We had made me the public face of Falcon. If word got out and it caused me to be perceived as unstable, it might have the potential to undermine our business endeavors, and it would certainly be a liability in our war of words with Daniel Moore. Naturally, Eamon knew somebody. Some calls were made, and a few days after our return to Illinois, I saw a doctor in Chicago who, by the look of the designer furniture in his rosewood-paneled waiting room, was probably not on any insurance company's list of preferred providers. The Holmes and Rahe stress scale measures an individual's level of stress by assigning points to life events. The doctor explained. It doesn't matter whether the events are good or bad, they're all stress elevators. A score of 300 points in a year puts a person at higher risk for stress-related illness. Based on your account of what you've experienced during the past year, your score is 848. The doctor's diagnosis confirmed Rebecca's suspicion that I was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder based on unresolved grief for my daughter and anger at my ex-wife, with the most serious episodes triggered by my visits to Rose Valley. But my PTSD paled by comparison to the chronic stress I was carrying from all the changes that my life had undergone. My workload, the responsibilities we had taken on for the jobs of hundreds of people, and the fact that my friends, family, and I were all under the protection of bodyguards. And as if that wasn't enough, I was also showing indications of depression. I left the office with a prescription for some low-dose medications and a stress management plan, and I'd be going back again every other week for the talking. Saving another company wasn't actually mandatory to meet Sophie's condition that no innocent people suffer from our scheme. We really only had to save the jobs of the company's employees. The Marvel plants, depots, and other facilities were refurbished. Instead of Marvel Bread, a Westover Foods company, their signs now read Marvel Bread, a Falcon LLC company, and the employees got a new company name and logo on their paychecks. Marvel proved to be easier to rebuild than Pathway had been. The equity group that owned Westover had sucked the life out of Happy Brands, but had pretty much ignored Marvel except for shifting revenue from Marvel around to make the entire company seem more profitable. Marvel's regional bread brands didn't have legs when it came to new markets, so we didn't ship much Psycho Sordo to the Midwest. But existing market sales were growing with the population of the Pacific Northwest and mountain regions, and that population was, and still is, growing pretty fast. On the other hand, all the depots we had acquired made it possible to greatly widen the distribution of Pathway brands. We had garnered nationwide publicity from our acquisition of Pathway, and the Christmas gift cards we handed out to its displaced workers, and in addition to the positive TV and business publication coverage, there was a lot of grassroots, support American workers, go out and buy Pathway sentiment on social media. Wholesale orders for that year's Christmas cookies maxed out production the week after Halloween, and we ended up having to put extra shifts on to be able to meet the demand. It was the biggest Christmas Pathway had ever had, even in its pre-Moore days, and the overtime made for very, very happy workers. The concessions the Marvel Workers Union had offered to induce Falcon to buy their company enabled us to bring Pathway workers up to equivalent pay levels after cost of living adjustments. And once we had pay and benefits equalized in all locations, we lifted the Marvel concessions and announced that all Falcon divisions were now in sync. The unions that represented the Marvel/Westover and Pathway employees eventually decided to associate and negotiate with us together. Don't ask me how that happened. The unions did it themselves, and we had no role in it. For our part, we were happy to be able to negotiate one nationwide contract. Marvel Bread combined with my doctor's plan turned out to be good for me. My blood pressure was down 20% by the end of December, and I learned to direct my dreams toward reliving better times with my daughter. We all rang in a very happy New Year 2014. Well, maybe not all of us. Our first quarterly meeting of 2014 was more or less perfunctory. Sales, plant performance, employee morale, all were going smoothly. Then we turned to the final results of our 4-year secret data project. I told you there would be more about this, remember? The tangible pathway assets we had acquired included not only the company's properties and production equipment, but also all of its computers, servers, and office equipment. And by acquiring Pathway's intangible assets, we had become the owners of all of its intellectual property, such as patents, recipes, manufacturing processes, all of its data, wherever it was. We had upgraded or replaced all of Pathway's office equipment, but we had removed all the data storage media for our secret data project, and in a building Falcon at least a few miles outside of Rose Valley, a team of Dennis's former staff members, fellow victims of the Moore purge of Maple Grove who we had hired as Falcon consultants, had been painstakingly recovering deleted data. Arrogance breeds carelessness. We had all seen how Moore's managers operated when we were at Maple Grove, and we knew they were not as smart as they thought they were. When Eamon told us that he suspected Moore had used Pathway's financials to commit fraud, we knew there was no way they could have left no proof. The mere fact that they had wiped all the drives in their computers on their way out the door as Pathway collapsed was like a neon sign that said, "Something to hide here." And Dennis knew just where to look for it. Wiping the hard drive in your computer is easy. You can download free software from the internet for that. But wiping the drives in your servers doesn't wipe the removable drives in a rotating backup scheme, especially after you've fired the IT staff you've been treating like peons for 5 years. Recent data on the company's backup drives was intact, and during the first couple of years Moore owned Pathway, the company's IT department was still running tape backups of the company's network server. Returning its staff produced boxes of old backup tapes that had been shoved into the back of a closet, and they yielded a wealth of 4- and 5-year-old data. Once we managed to buy replacement tape drives and a copy of the now obsolete backup software on eBay, the data transmitted through Pathway's wireless phone and internet accounts was also a company asset. Every time one of Moore's people had sent or received email or text messages using their cell phones, copies of them were being held on some server in the bowels of USA Wireless for 7 years, and all of those accounts now belong to us. And did you know that digital copy/fax machines scan the documents you feed into them, use that scanned data to make automatic resend attempts if needed, and then hold it until you delete it? Moore's people apparently didn't. As each new cache of data was recovered by Dennis's team, it was handed off to another team made up of Lucy's fired Maple Grove accountants and business analysts. Lucy's team spent 3 years crunching the numbers and the data that Dennis and his team recovered and reconstructing Moore's financial transactions, and all of our suspicions about how Pathway was used to commit fraud and then raided for every penny that could be stolen from it were confirmed. Moore had used the same crooked finance team for all his illegal operations, and for 5 years they were operating mostly out of the finance offices at Pathway Bakeries, using Pathway's office computers, network servers, telephones, and office equipment. We couldn't recreate complete data trails for every scam because Pathway systems weren't used for everything, but we recovered the emails they had exchanged while making their plans, and the numbers of the overseas accounts they used to hide money looted from Pathway and 2 other companies they owned, Wilson Energy and Paulson Mining. And then there were the records Dennis found of Moore's scheme to engineer the takeover of Maple Grove Mills. As most everyone knows by now, during the first half of the last decade, millions of people across the U.S. were victimized by predatory lenders, fraudulent real estate appraisers, and crooked securities bundlers. At one point, almost 11% of all U.S. home mortgages were underwater, and nobody knew it until it all blew up. Most news reports will tell you that the city with the highest percentage of underwater mortgages was Newark, New Jersey, where some 54% of all homes were worth less than their owners owed on them. But underwater home loans represented more than 60% of all the mortgages in Rose Valley, and virtually all of them had been made to people who would have a vote in a Maple Grove buyout. 80% of the loans made to Rose Valley homeowners had come from a Los Angeles-based lender, Countryway Bank. From 1999 until 2004, the period during which America's most toxic mortgages were issued, 7 of the 12 members of the board of Countryway Bank were also shareholders in More Equity Partners, and all 7 of them had resigned or retired from the board by the time Countryway had failed and gone into FDIC receivership. Daniel Moore and his partners had carried out a systematic plan to push enough Maple Grove Mill shareholders into financial distress to make the company susceptible to a carefully timed buyout offer. They conspired to ruin half the people in our town so that they could take over one company. "Scumsuckers," Lucy muttered. "Oh, sorry," she said, her face turning scarlet as she realized that she had said it aloud. None of us had ever heard anything like that come out of Lucy's mouth before. "That's okay," Dennis replied. "I said the exact same thing when I saw this." Marty and I were just speechless. We turned all the data we had recovered over to the federal government's newly formed Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and explained to them how we had come by it. In the next 3 months, we explained it again to the Federal Trade Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Federal Reserve, and then to their equivalent state agencies in Illinois, Oregon, Texas, Wyoming, and Nevada. April 12, 2014. DOJ, SEC, and IRS-level fraud and tax evasion charges against More Equity Partners CEO Moore. The U.S. Department of Justice, the U.S. Securities Exchange Commission, and the U.S. Internal Revenue Service have announced charges and an asset freeze against Daniel Moore and More Equity Partners LLC, saying that they operated the former Pathway Bakeries of Kelton, Illinois, Wilson Energy Incorporated of Dallas, Texas, and Paulson Mining Incorporated of Cheyenne, Wyoming, as the centerpiece of a $3.2 billion fraud scheme. Our complaint alleges that Moore's business model was a sham, added Stephen Perkin, director of the SEC's Enforcement Division. The only way Moore was able to make loan payments was by continually obtaining additional fraudulently borrowed money. The Justice Department says Moore falsified revenues and asset values in order to obtain loans secured by company assets. In reality, the Justice Department says Moore operated a scheme in which fraudulently borrowed money was used to pay previously defrauded lenders. The SEC is seeking return of allegedly ill-gotten gains with interest and financial penalties, according to the Commission. Our complaint further alleges that Moore used a web of layered companies and offshore bank accounts to conceal the proceeds of his fraud, said Edward Buscandi, director of the Internal Revenue Service's Chicago Regional Office. Moore used the scheme to line his pockets with millions of defaulted dollars and conceal them for purposes of tax evasion. A federal court hearing is next scheduled for December 29. The IRS has requested that the asset freeze continue. The trials lasted over a year, during which Moore repeatedly proclaimed that all the data being used as evidence against him was faked. Dennis and Lucy testified about the forensic work their staffs had done to recover the Pathway data, and Moore's defense was never able to explain how the fake data had included actual numbers for bank accounts into the Bahamas, Cayman Islands, Belize, and Luxembourg that contained over $1 billion that had never been reported as income to the IRS. They just didn't see it coming. June 24, 2015. CEO sentenced for fraud and tax evasion. The former CEO of More Equity Partners was sentenced to 60 years in prison for fraud and tax evasion Friday in federal court. Daniel D. Moore, 58, founded More Equity Partners in 1985. At its peak, the business owned and managed 5 companies throughout the United States. Moore was convicted of conspiracy and falsifying revenues and asset values in order to fraudulently obtain loans secured by company assets. The fraudulently borrowed money was used to make payments to previously defrauded lenders. Moore was also convicted of concealing the proceeds of his fraud to evade taxes. Moore was ordered to pay $3.2 billion in restitution to the lenders and other creditors he defrauded. In addition to Daniel Moore, the 7 other partners of Moore Equity Partners and more than a dozen of their employees were indicted on the same charges. All were either convicted or allowed to plead guilty to lesser charges in exchange for testifying about how Moore and his partners directed their illegal actions. We were disappointed, however, when the DOJ decided that the predatory mortgage scheme Moore had carried out on the citizens of Rose Valley, like the rest of the nationwide mortgage scandal, consisted only of civil violations, and no one would face criminal charges for any of it. The government instituted criminal forfeiture actions against Moore Equity Partners and its principals. $2.8 billion in cash came from the offshore accounts. The company's business assets and the conspirators' personal assets, investments, homes, yachts, private jets, cars, etc., were also seized and ordered sold. Falcon Associates LLC received a whistleblower award from the IRS for 30% of the total amount recovered from Daniel Moore and the other principals of Moore Equity Partners. The award won't be paid out until all the assets have been disposed of, which may take years due to all the ongoing appeals. But if our estimates are correct, at $960 million, it will be the largest such award in history. Our scheme to bring down Daniel Moore by bringing his victimized businesses back from the dead will end up making a profit of nearly $600 million. Although my ex-wife had been employed in the Maple Grove Mills Finance Group under Moore's ownership, she was not charged in any of Moore's crimes. The court allowed her to keep the $500,000 in cash, the $1.6 million La Condo, and several cars that Moore had put in her name when she married him. Until she is released, all her assets are being managed by a court-appointed guardian due to her lack of family members willing to assume responsibility for them, and she can only access what can be deposited into her commissary account each month. She still has another 3 years to serve before she's eligible for parole, but when she gets out, she won't end up as penniless Kitchenell. Eamon Sewells died peacefully in his sleep on October 2, 2015. He was 91 years old. No evidence had ever been found that Daniel Moore was behind his son's death or any other crimes than financial. Despite all his bluster, the man had turned out to be a toothless lion. But we hope that seeing Moore locked up for a long time had provided Eamon with some measure of satisfaction, because ultimately Eamon and Jeff had been right. Moore's greed had been the driving force behind all the suffering that had followed in his wake. Eamon's memorial was a very private affair, consisting of his daughter-in-law, his 2 grandchildren, and several lifelong friends. We did not attend, as his wish to the end was that no one outside our small band of conspirators should ever connect him or his money to Falcon Associates LLC. It would keep us safe from whatever enemies he might have made in his past, and Sophie and his grandchildren safe from whatever enemies we might make in our future. The media reported that Eamon had left several $1 million to various charitable foundations, and that the only other heirs to his vast shipping empire were his daughter-in-law and his grandchildren. Several weeks after the reading of the will, we met with Sophie in the Timberline condominium. Eamon has bequeathed his interest in Falcon Associates to me, Sophie told us, so we will continue to be business partners for as long as we all find it mutually agreeable. She handed us each a document, which proved to be a financial statement, and we were surprised as all hell to see what it said. $1 billion. Lucy gasped. Added to the funds already in the Falcon accounts, our 1/8 interest in the company amounted to more than $200 million each. Eamon's final investment, Sophie confirmed. He told me that of all the many things he had put his money into, Falcon was the one he was most proud of. It is ironic that no one outside this room will ever know that he made it. And he left you this letter. To my dear friends. By now Sophie will have informed you of my final deposit into the Falcon accounts. I know you will do good things with it. I want the 4 of you to know how thankful I am for having known you, and for what you have done for me. I do not only speak of bringing about justice for my honor. I also speak of what you have done for my soul. Since I met and loved my Manon, I have tried to become a better man so that I might be worthy of her. But I have always doubted my success at this. You have allowed me to live my final days fighting on the side of the angels, and I pray I have finally redeemed myself so that I may be permitted to see my wife and son again. For that I am eternally grateful to you all. Thank you. Forever your friend, Eamon. P.S. Save as many of them as you can. And so, Sophie asked with a smile, who are we to be saving next? Falcon Associates, LLC completes purchase of assets of more equity partners. Albuquerque, New Mexico, December 4, 2015. Falcon Associates, LLC today announced that it has completed the purchase of the assets of more equity partners of Reno, Nevada. Under the terms of the asset purchase agreement, Falcon has acquired substantially all of the assets of More for approximately $528 million. More Equity's assets were seized by the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Internal Revenue Service in connection with fraud and tax evasion actions against the company and the conviction of its chairman, Daniel J. Moore, and consist of 3 businesses operated by the company. Wilson Energy Incorporated of Dallas, Texas, Paulson Mining Incorporated of Cheyenne, Wyoming, and Maple Grove Mills Incorporated of Rose Valley. Or, Moore's operation of Wilson Energy and Paulson Mining was based on environmental destruction and the displacement of indigenous peoples, commented Roger Richardson, Managing Director of Falcon LLC. We will cease these operations immediately and do everything in our power to undo the harm they committed. We will also reform the operation of the Maple Grove Mills to restore it to the position it once held as a leading purveyor of the highest quality products. All Falcon Associates companies will adhere to the highest standards of business integrity. Source: Falcon Associates, LLC. Wilson Energy and Paulson Mining turned out to be shadows, nothing more than holding companies and more ways for Moore and his partners to steal money from investors. That turned out to actually be a good thing, because the mass destruction they had promised to unleash upon the rainforest was just another fraud. When we pulled the contracts for the rainforest deal with San Lawrence and cut loose all the thugs who'd been hired to make a show of burning out the homes of the indigenous tribes, there were barely 200 actual employees between both companies worldwide. Given what they originally hired on to do, we weren't nearly as motivated to save their jobs. But we've given them a chance. If they'll work to advance the newly formed Falcon Environmental Group's first South American venture. It's an enormous gamble because nobody has ever successfully replanted such a large expanse of deforested prime rainforest. But it's attracted some of the world's leading environmental scientists, and if we succeed, the potential for creating jobs in environmental restoration is enormous. And that brings us to today. I'm in the office of a warehouse on the grounds of the Maple Grove Mills. It's the only building in town large enough to hold all the mill's employees, current and former, and their families. This afternoon we constructed a temporary stage out of scaffolding, and right now about 70% of the population of Rose Valley, Oregon, is waiting for the 4 of us to come out and talk to them. We're going to start with the Falcon pitch, our mantra about success through dedication to quality and business integrity. We'll remind them that Maple Grove used to be a place that cared about the quality of the work people did and treated them with respect and fairness. And we're going to reassure them that we can make this work and that it shouldn't be that hard because it's the way we always used to do things. But rebuilding Maple Grove isn't going to be like saving Pathway or Marvel or even Wilson and Paulson. The people in those companies were all in the same boat, together, and didn't split into factions for and against selling their companies. A third of Maple Grove's workers were kicked out the door 4 years ago, not just for a few months. Yes, we hired most of the marketing, finance, and technology people as Falcon consultants and helped place other fired Maple Grove workers in jobs with Marvel in Portland and Spokane, and will offer all of them their jobs back at Maple Grove. But a lot of them may choose not to return, and many of those who do come home will still have hard feelings about the fact that their neighbors, co-workers, and in some cases even family, got dollar signs in their eyes, overextended themselves, and then panicked and sold the lifeblood of our community out from under us. I know that because I'm one of them, and just as I continue to work through the personal demons that have haunted me for so long, we all have to resolve our feelings, because if we don't, they'll eat us alive. I'm going to talk frankly about what we let happen to our town, what it cost us, and how we have to cope with our feelings about it, and live and work together if we're going to put our hometown right. Yes, I said our hometown. Using me as the public face of Falcon turned me into the personification of all the pain this town has suffered. And in order for my words to mean anything, I have to come back here too and try to make Rose Valley home again. Because if we can't, then the scum sucker who did this to us still wins. If you're not sure whether my story has a happy ending, welcome to the club. Yes, I went from being unemployed to being a partner in a billion-dollar business. My faithless, backstabbing ex-wife will be incarcerated in an Oregon state prison for another 3 years. The arrogant villain of the piece is a penniless convict in a federal penitentiary in Illinois for what will probably be the rest of his life, and more than 1,000 formerly unemployed workers and their families in a half-dozen states across the U.S. look at me as if I walk on water. I trade it all in a heartbeat to hold my little girl in my arms again. There's a hole in my heart that hasn't been healed by either success or justice. As for love, it'll be a while before I'll think about rolling those dice again, if ever. But my life isn't over yet, and I had a lot to keep me busy. So I guess there really isn't an ending yet, and if I can't say I'm happy, at least I have purpose. And for now, that's enough. Maybe I have hope after all. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.